he was a warrior out of antiquity.
This character looms large in the mythology of America.
It was the individual by himself striving to achieve goals that were unachievable.
Rambo was a hero who was strong, who was decisive, who was action-oriented.
We're gonna win this time.
This became a fantasy of white male escapism.
Please, I am a defender of Rambo. I'm a defender of Sylvester Stallone. I think you've got the wrong take on this character.
Fuck him.
The Rambo films were some of the most popular artifacts coming out of Hollywood culture in the 1980s.
I don't know how many men I've met who say that they've watched the Rambo films to the point where they can't count anymore.
First Blood, I think, did about $57 million in the domestic box office. Rambo did 150 here and did over 200 and something for it.
Rambo 3. Stallone.
What the hell is going on? Who is this?
Initial international engagements have broken industry records, signaling the return of that global phenomenon known as Rambo mania.
I can remember the success of Rambo 2 vividly because I went over to the Pentagon and used the success as a reason to bring some finality to the problem of our missing in action in Vietnam.
He became a actually global figure of the military hero. In El Salvador, for instance, both the rebels and the government forces wore Rambo headbands, as did Israelis, Palestinians. These films promoted militarism on the level of everyday life. There were Rambo grams where people gave telegrams to their bosses, all kinds of cultural artifacts, Rambo's knives, his guns and bow and arrows, posters of Rambo. It became a big franchise business, and it took place all over the world.
Rambo may be the strangest franchise in the history of Hollywood. Here you actually have someone who's playing a guy who is wounded, badly treated, mistrusts authority, and spends much of the movie exacting vengeance on people who have done wrong, and he's then linked to toys.
I got to win this time.
I never thought I'd be on a lunchbox or I'd be on an eraser or whatever, and Rambo dolls.
There were Rambo film out today. You bet at Christmas time I'd buy a Rambo figure.
I think that the protests, and I had a great deal of them, it was just a little uncalled for. I don't think that Rambo was responsible for setting any new trend in kind of a new wave of violence.
Massive exposure to media violence helps to reinforce over and over again in the minds of young boys and young men in particular that manhood and violence are interlinked concepts.
All those controversies were very good for us, frankly, because that kind of publicity actually helps sell whatever you're selling because it's bringing attention to its existence.
My God, nice body. What a, ooh, Jesus. He was a man that basically had given up his own identity. He had no family. He really never harkened back to his past. He never really thought about the future.
He is alone. He is left now somehow to live out the legacy of his experiences in the war.
He had been betrayed abroad, and he was now being betrayed at home. That was a very popular and successful idea, and that's a classic American idea. The idea of the loner who stumbles into town with the evil sheriff, you know, goes back to Westerns, it goes back to Dashiell Hammett.
First Blood is a Western. This is the loner coming to town. He's the gunfighter who wants to hang up his guns. And people pick on him, but they don't know he's the fastest gun in the West.
The classic military hero in Hollywood films is a tough guy who's part of a unit. In fact, he's the leader of the unit, or he's the brave, crazy guy in the unit. What makes Rambo separate is that essentially he's always cut off from any unit. You have Chuck Norris, you have Schwarzenegger, and of course you have Stallone. In some ways, they're all making a similar kind of film. They're about the loner who's really very good at fighting, who's surrounded by a corrupt system, a system that they believed in, but has somehow let them down, and so they now have to take care of the action themselves.
Rambo appropriates hippie countercultural iconography for the conservative individualist, the macho man of the Reagan era. He eats natural foods. He blends in perfectly with nature.
Let it go.
If he were a guy in a military uniform going off and doing all these things, he would seem like a member of the system and sort of a jerk and a creep, and he'd be scarier. But when you put him in the counterculture garb, he's got this weird charge, because he's simultaneously sort of a hippie and at the same time sort of a militarist. He's a blue-collar counterculture guy. You know, because by the time these films were coming out, the people who wore the pendants and bandanas and had the hair that way were more likely to be working-class guys who worked in factories.
Now, this took place during the early 80s when the white men were losing their jobs. Reaganomics meant that there was more money for the wealthy and less government programs, less jobs for the working. But then, in Rambo 2 and 3, he becomes a warrior, he becomes a god, a mythical figure. So it's a fantasy of the transcendence of class. In other words, you may be poor, you may not have job skills, but you can become a superhero, you can become a warrior.
Who do you think this man is? Good. Oh, God, would have mercy. He won't.
He's both working class, but also without working class consciousness completely. He's with a nationalist consciousness, in other words, the patriot.
The war, everything that happened here may be wrong, but damn it, don't hate your country for it.
Hey, I die for it.
But the patriot who always also rebels against the higher-ups, the government.
You're just a tool. We're the machine.
One of the strongest themes in all three of the Rambo films is an anti-big government mentality, which is very much part of the Reagan-era philosophy.
In fact, when I think of all the good people who've pleaded with the federal government for years to clean up our tax structure, I'm reminded of a recent, very popular movie. And in the spirit of Rambo, let me tell you, we're going to win this time.
When I heard President Reagan quoting lines from Rambo and just bringing the film into focus, I was proud, but I was a little apprehensive about the reaction, because this is, right now, it had taken a political form. And people thought, okay, Rambo is a Republican.
Both Rambo and Reagan are typical figures of American individualism, that each individual can make it. They shouldn't rely on government, but on their own strength, their own abilities to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Ronald Reagan had a philosophy of limited government and maximum freedom of the individual. The theme in the Rambo movies was exactly that, the freedom of the individual, the freedom from oppressive government.
Reagan's advisors would try to base his economic policies on American heroes of individualism and self-reliance. But I think actually, Reagan's policies are a far cry from certainly what Emerson and Thoreau believed of. His stealing of the notion of individualism and self-reliance was really for the purpose of enhancing the power of corporate America.
So why are you pushing me? I haven't done anything to you.
First of all, you don't ask the questions around here. I do. You understand?
We were not glorifying one man against the world. This was one man who was being crushed by what had happened.
He never declared war. His war was always fought basically in retreat, trying to get away from so-called the enemy. 90% of Rambo, he is always running.
You don't make a move, I'll blow your head off!
I didn't do anything!
Oh! He's a victim. It's not his fault. He's just trying to get along in life, and he's being picked on and picked on and picked on until what I used to call a just rage occurred.
They drew first blood, not me.
In all three films, this is basically the structure. He avoids until finally when he does say, all right, you asked for it. It's an overwhelming response, but we accept it because we know how much he suffered.
Don't move.
I don't want you to cut your own throat.
With almost every actor, your face is your destiny. Stallone has basset hound eyes, and he's got very firm features, and the eyes kind of war against the firmness of the features. The eyes are sad, the rest of him is kind of tough and resolute.
When he breaks down and starts to cry, you see the pain, the kind of pain that he's in.
He basically has a nervous breakdown and cannot deal with all the pent-up stimulus that he's been basically forced to absorb. In other words, the war, his isolation, the death of his friends, and it explodes in a frenzy where he cannot keep all the thoughts together.
I can't get it out of my head. I do this 7 years. Every day it hurts. Sometimes I wake up, I don't know where I am. I don't talk to anybody.
Stallone, at that point, was at his peak of somehow bringing to bear the thing that people liked in Rocky, which was that he could play a human being, with the sort of inhuman side of Rambo, which is the killing machine.
What you saw was a new character being developed in Hollywood. You saw this man being super macho, but with a heart.
Even though he's shooting everybody up, he's really vulnerable and sensitive. The lone gunman used to be this crazy badass who'd come into town, and he was the scariest guy, he was the fastest guy. Now he's wounded.
In the first film, his arm is cut, and then he sews it up himself. In the second film, he's tortured by the Soviet captors. In the third film, he's wounded in his first rescue attempt and actually has a piece of shrapnel that cuts right through his abdomen.
Rambo became a symbol, I think, of the America that was wounded but wasn't afraid to fight back.
One of the things that characterizes the Reagan era, and Reagan embodied this in some ways himself, is a focus on the body. Often remembered image of Ronald Reagan was his picture of him at his ranch, chopping wood, dressed in Western clothing, riding horses. This re-emphasis on bodies was shown in fitness clubs with health regimens, aerobics, weightlifting. Then we saw these new, robust, very built kinds of heroes showing up in the action films.
Acting is as physical as it is mental.
The physical aspects of it was about 8 months of training, 4 hours a day. The SWAT combat courses, the archery courses, the survivalist courses. I trained about 12 to 14 months getting the body in shape and hard enough to withstand the rigors of what we went through.
Stallone is now the modern idea of the beefcake hero.
It's a hero who's sweating all the time. It's a hero whose muscles are always in your face. It's a hero who mumbles. He's not as articulate or sophisticated in the manner of Sean Connery.
Rambo's very body becomes a war machine, a killing machine, where the knife is an extension of his body.
The basic idea of Rambo films is that they are male sanctuaries. And I think in some ways they are a crucible of masculinity. And they're probably some way in which they're a response to the women's movement. Because in fact it's positing this world in which women barely exist.
Did not expect a woman, no.
This is the warrior ideology where the male warrior has to be ascetic. He can't have any sexual or romantic entanglements with women. In Rambo 2, where he goes to Vietnam, you see him actually connected with a Vietnamese woman who's his helpmate during the movie.
Rambo, you're not expendable.
And it looks like there's going to be a romantic interest between them. They have a kiss that becomes the kiss of death. She's eliminated right afterwards, as if women are threatening or they're dangerous to the great warrior.
This kind of character always has his most important relationships be with men.
You're the only one I trust. Colonel Troutman was certainly a father figure. I always saw him as such. And that's why it was so hard when Troutman is basically brought back to hunt him down. I said, wait a minute, I was your son, I gave you everything. I felt very much like the character in East of Eden when James Dean is like trying to embrace his father and saying, you know, please, what more do I have to do for you to love me? When he's holding me, it isn't like we see in his eyes like, oh my God, what have I done? There's a kind of shame and what have I done, but also I am a soldier and I can't completely break away. Rambo really did need love, needed some kind of human contact.
Men have always experienced a range of emotions. The question here is whether it's publicly okay to show that and still maintain your sort of masculine status.
By the time you get to Rambo 3, Troutman is the one who has been kidnapped by Soviet military figures in Afghanistan. It turns out that Rambo is the only one who can go in and rescue him.
They're blood brother warriors.
It's good timing. What are friends for?
Rambo has in some ways become the protector of his father rather than the son who had to be protected by the father.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger.
Many people talked about Ronald Reagan as a father figure. He, I think, really embodied that sense of it being in some ways a father to the country.
Ronald Reagan's image was in direct contrast to the previous president's image, Jimmy Carter's image, which was certainly by the end of his presidency as an emasculated, weak leader who was responsible for the United States being brought low.
The one thing that Reagan really contributed very clearly is this sense of a resurgence of an interest in and a pride in being American. You could see it as a clear sort of backlash or just a plain relief at the anti-Americanism that had been openly discussed in the 70s as part of the anti-war movement, as part of the concerns over American imperialism, as part of the concerns about racism, about sexism.
The whole phenomenon of Reagan Democrats is all about the masculinization of the Republican Party and the emasculation of the Democratic Party for the purpose of attracting white working-class male voters, and it was a fabulously successful strategy.
You remember in the first movie, Rambo took over a town. In the second, he single-handedly defeated several communist armies. And now in the third Rambo film, they say he really gets tough. Almost makes me wish I could serve a third term.
The Rambo films became so popular because they embodied exactly the same kinds of characteristics that made Reagan so popular. Rambo was a hero who was strong, who was decisive, who was action-oriented, who didn't deliberate over long periods of time, who didn't tolerate inaction, especially when it meant risking the lives and welfare of other people.
Rambo's a man whose voice is carried out through action. Rambo lets nothing out. It all comes out through physical verification. He didn't waste energy. He would analyze, and then pursue. He didn't debate. He would take in the situation, okay, I am going to remedy it by going in this route. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to discuss it.
What about orders?
No more orders, Cole.
The strong, silent type.
The typical American warrior, the fighting guy that says, well, I'm not going to ask all the diplomatic questions, but I'm going to do what you want me to do fighting for freedom.
Rambo actually fits this world vision whereby we don't think about policies, we only think about who has moral superiority.
The most important value a hero should portray is truth, which is to say, there is good, there is evil, and that is truth. There is right, there is wrong, that is truth.
And this is scary, because if your adversary is evil, there's nothing you can do but to violently eliminate them.
When he used the evil empire term in his speech, everybody in the diplomatic corps was telling him, don't do it. But there was a little spark in him, a Rambo-esque spark that said, call it what it is. Nail it down. It is an evil empire.
Along came Rambo, and it said precisely that. And the good guys were good guys, and they wore white hats, and through ingenuity, they were able to defeat this evil empire.
It's true that the other side might very well be evil. It doesn't make us good. But if you think that the other side is evil and that you are good, then it justifies anything you do against that evil. And then what you do may actually be a representation itself of something evil.
Reagan himself was very interventionist with Libyan bombing, with interventions in Grenada, supporting the Contras. So he carried out a very militarist, a very activist foreign policy, and that kind of militarism and activism is embodied in the Rambo films.
I think the idea that Rambo is right-wing and jingoistic is really ill-phrased, because Rambo denies any association, quote, with the military. He's not part of it.
You not look like you are with military.
I'm not.
What are you? Los tourists.
I'm no tourist. The military uniform is almost a hindrance. He would not stand there and wear the American trademark uniform because he had no allegiance to, quote, the military.
Is the person to do the work that the government cannot do. He's ultimately the representative of the mind, of the covert action.
The covert operations being geared up in the Far East. Your name was dug out by the computer as one of 3 most able to complete the mission.
All through Central America, the Reagan administration had intervened militarily using Rambo surrogates. Oliver North, for instance, is sometimes coded as a Rambo-esque Reaganite warrior.
Ollie North will always think it was a compliment that people said he was Rambo-esque. To him that meant cut through the bureaucratic red tape, be a man of action, see if you can get something done because you're trying to save lives.
The biggest covert operation during the Reagan era was an intervention in Afghanistan. The United States spent billions of dollars supporting the Islamic fundamentalists, the rebels who were fighting against the Soviet Union, who at that time was the occupying force. So the kind of covert operation that Colonel Troutman and Rambo were engaged in Rambo 3 in Afghanistan was actually taking place.
The American military had been thoroughly trashed by Hollywood in movie after movie after movie. And along came a movie, Rambo 2, that said there's a dignity to the American serviceman, and there's a value to them, and they ought to be saluted for what it was that they tried to do on behalf of their country.
Do we get to win this time?
This time it's up to you.
Do we get to win this time? And yes, we kicked their ass. This time it is military victory. Basically, you have compensation for U.S. military defeat in Vietnam.
That line caused a lot of people who had been in Vietnam to cheer when the film came out.
It's one of the central ideological premises of the Reagan era was that earlier generations had misread what happened in Vietnam, and that in fact we could have easily won if we'd simply let our fighting men fight. Rambo becomes the ultimate proof of that, because essentially he's able to win the Vietnam War all by himself.
Wolf Den, this is Lone Wolf. Do you read? Wolf Den, this is Lone Wolf. Over.
Yes, we hear you, Lone Wolf. Over.
Prepare for emergency landing. Arriving with American POWs.
During the films, audiences would cheer Rambo's military exploits and start chanting, USA, USA.
No one in the government had the guts to do what this character is doing.
The whole point is we were right to be in Vietnam, we should have been in Vietnam, the soldiers were great in Vietnam, and in fact the bosses and the system in some vague sense did them in.
Mission accomplished.
That transformation of a sort of unknown veteran at the beginning of First Blood to this heroic, recognized figure at the end of Rambo 3 parallels in some ways the rebuilding of the military and the rebuilding of the image of soldiers that really was accomplished during the Reagan era.
Army Rambo, and it's unfortunate because, you know, the men in the military are the real deal. Rambo is fiction.
It's amazing how pop culture things take hold and really do take hold. Rambo became one of those things like the Clint Eastwood line, "Make my day," that you just couldn't escape. It shaped people's ideas about lots of things.
We have taken this character that is, you know, a fictional character, and it's now gone well beyond me, well beyond any kind of conception that we had thought up in the beginning.
We'll always think of Rambo as the essential spirit of the 80s, of the period when Reagan was our president.
The movie Rambo struck a chord with Ronald Reagan because Ronald Reagan was a product of Hollywood. He understood that industry.
As you look at all three of the Rambo films, because they span the period of Reagan's presidency, you can really look at them almost as a historical litmus test.
Rambo, the character, becomes such a hero, such a cultural icon, precisely because he's a kind of a modern fairy tale.
I think it really taps into a primitive side of like the id. This mythical drifter that is brought out, asked to do extraordinary deeds. He does it because he wants to, and he doesn't care about his own demise.